What do you see here behind me? I'll tell you what you see. You see a paved road leading off into the wilderness. So what? Big deal. Yeah, it really is a big deal. Out here in the J.J. Mays Wildlife Trace, out here in Chambers County, they finally got around to paving this road. I can't help but rejoice a little bit when I pull into it now. Why is that? Because for years and years it was just a rough gravel chat road, and storms, floods had taken its toll over the years, and it was really washboarded. It was full of bomb craters. It was not very accessible. You had to really want to come out here. You really had to think about whether it was worth the price of a wheel alignment or not in places. But now a paved road, well, it just makes it all the more easily accessible to everyone. It's good. What's it going to be like for you to do whatever it takes to really get on down the road with Jesus Christ? I mean, to have a real relationship with God. To not just rest on good intentions and someday get around to it, but to actually experience it. What's it going to take for you to focus on what really needs to be done, to give your real attention to God and to hear deeply what He says, so that your convictions are formed, so that you cannot help but act on them? What will it finally take to move you so that you dare to approach God to begin with and to let Him have some say with you? Those are questions I ask myself often. And the reason I ask those questions of myself is because they're really formed by what forms the end of a sermon that Jesus preached one time. It's recorded in Luke chapter 6 and is known as the Sermon on the Plain. That's what this sermon series has been about, Jesus being on the level with us, speaking clearly and candidly to us. Can we hear Him? You know how that sermon ends. It ends with a story. It's a story that we even teach our children to sing. There was a wise man who built his house on a rock, and the storms came, and it didn't even shake the place. And there was a foolish man, and he chose to build his house on something less than rock. And the storms came, and it was a total loss. It's a sobering story. All the more sobering for me because a number of years back I was doing some genealogical research, and I came across an account of how some of my ancestors had moved to another part of this country that they had never been to before, and they decided to put down stakes and live there. And they chose an area not far from a creek, and it was beautiful, and it was flat, it was lush, it seemed to have everything. The only problem is within a year, a large flood had come, and it washed the entire community away. Fortunately, no one was hurt. They were able to get to higher ground. All of them, no loss of life, but a total loss of absolutely everything else. And everyone had to start all over. And when they did, guess where they went? Not back to where they had been, on what appeared to be hard ground, but had just been that hard red clay of Oklahoma that looks hard as rock, but when a storm or a flood comes, it really turns to something more like pudding. It's not going to hold up anything. They decided to relocate up on higher ground, 2 or 3 miles away, much rockier ground on a hill. Real wisdom. If only they had been paying closer attention at the beginning. If only they had dared to approach the matters with an objective eye and not put off what really needed to be done. That is, going to extra effort to find higher ground and consider the storms of life that could come and being prepared in advance for them. Lesson learned, lesson lived. You and I only have one shot. One chance. We don't get a second shot in terms of a life connected with God. It's appointed for us once to live and then to die. Our life will be measured with what we did with this one life of ours. We say it's ours. But then Jesus shows up and says, your life is mine. Do you remember the sentence that precedes that story of the wise man and the foolish man? Maybe not. You remember the story, but do you remember the springboard into the story, the whole point of telling the story? Jesus leans in and looks right in his closest followers' eyes, and he says, you can read it for yourself in Luke chapter 6, verse 46. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? Wow. Did Jesus' closest followers have an obedience problem? Well, to be sure, he's speaking not only to his closest disciples, the apostles. He's speaking to a large crowd that's gathered around and is also overhearing this. But Jesus is speaking words that we all need to hear, whether we discern ourselves as very tight with Jesus or far from God or somewhere in between. There are no exceptions. We all need to hear this question often daily. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? You see, we humans are inclined to not do what Jesus says. We are inclined not to approach God. We are masters of deception of ourselves. We distract ourselves. We think that we're really present with Jesus when only at best we're partly present with him. And we seem to have mastered the art of procrastination. Oh Lord, I'll do what you say. I'll get around to that. The only problem is we don't get around to it as often as we should. And we hear Jesus whisper in our ear or straight in our face say it very strong and clear. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? When are we going to really get down the road together? You see, it's one thing to say that I'll approach God. It's another thing to say I'll give my attention to Jesus. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The real talk with God comes down to a walk with God. What are you going to do about what he says? You know, maybe we need to pay close attention to what Jesus did before we pay attention to what Jesus said. See, before Jesus ever said these things to his disciples and all the others, he walked the talk himself. That is, he knew that his practice would affect how they heard him preach. And what was Jesus' practice? I believe there are several things said in the run-up in Luke chapter 1 through 5 before we get to the sermon in chapter 6 that give us clues. But one thing that Luke, the author of Luke's Gospel, seems to underscore is a habit that Jesus had. Jesus says, you call me Lord. I want to see you do what I say. That is, I want to see you continually do this. I want this to be a habit, a way of life. This is your behavior. Well, what was Jesus' behavior? What was his habit or habits? Luke underscores the thought that Jesus would carve out time quite deliberately and consistently to be alone with his Father and to talk to him. You can read it for yourself in Luke chapter 5 and verse 16. You can read more of it hinted at clearly in chapter 4 and verse 42. And I believe there's other places in Luke's Gospel, but those two instances alone underscore the immediate run-up or springboard into this sermon, and they feed the closure of the sermon. We're told by the way Jesus acted that if we want to get around to doing what Jesus said, we'll have to act like he did. And one of the best things that we can do is carve out some deliberate time that we can speak with our Father very frankly about doing his will. How often do you or I really get around to that? You can pray about a lot of things. Lord, get me out of this jam. There's a storm in my life. Or Lord, forgive me. I didn't do what you told me to do here and other matters. But what if we were more proactive and spent most of our time praying not for forgiveness or, Lord, just get me out of this bad situation, And instead we prayed, Lord, I want to be yours no matter what the situation. And Lord, please remember this. I did this right. I did what you said. What if we prayed that way more and more often? What if we prayed that way like Jesus probably did when he went off by himself to pray? He's not getting out by himself to pray just so he can be alone, but so he can pray aloud. We've all probably had the experience of when we say something aloud to ourselves, it seems to sink in a bit more deeply. Maybe there's a hint for a habit, a practice that will help you practice what it means to do what Jesus says. Let's be on the level with ourselves as we seek to hear Jesus really on the level with us. Grace and peace be with us all. Build wisely.